Hello and welcome to Building Sustainable Supply Chains. What is the future? My name is Connie and I'll be in the background answering any WebEx technical questions. If you experience technical difficulties joining the WebEx session, please dial 1-866-229-3239. Please note that as an attendee, you are part of a larger audience. However, due to privacy rights, we have chosen not to display the number or list of attendees to everyone on the call today. All attendees will be in a listen-only mode throughout the duration of today's call. As a reminder, today's call is being recorded. We will be holding a Q&A session at the conclusion of today's presentation. You may ask an online question anytime throughout the presentation today by simply clicking on the question mark icon located on the floating toolbar at the top of your screen or on the right side of your screen. With that, we invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy today's presentation. I would now like to introduce one of your presenters for today, Constance Correll, Director of Marketing. Constance, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Connie. Welcome to Building the Green Supply Chain webinar, part of our monthly webinar series. And as Connie said, I am your host, Constance Correll, Director of Marketing for Supply Chain Insights. Today's webinar Twitter hashtag is SCI Webinar. So please feel free to share your thoughts in the social networks. In the next hour, you will hear from Lora Cecere, founder of Supply Chain Insights, and John Davies with Greenbiz Group, as they present their findings in the latest same-titled research report, Building the Green Supply Chain, available on the supplychaininsights.com website. Our very special guest panelists who are going to share their insights on the findings include Peter Murray, Supply Chain Development and Innovation Leader with the DuPont Corporate Center for Integrated Operations and Supply Chain Management, and David Lyons, Senior Vice President, Operations and Supply Chain of Wells Dairy. As Connie said, please go ahead and ask questions and participate in our poll throughout the event, as we would like to have this next hour interactive. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Lora Cecere and John Davies.
Thank you so much, Constance. And John, I'm just so excited about these results. Supply Chain Insights was fortunate to partner with Greenbiz to do this study. And our objective was to understand the current state of the corporate social responsibility goals and their alignment with the greater supply chain organization. We conducted it in January, and it did not take us long to get a response. The energy was very high to finish the survey, and the follow-up questions have been really coming at us strongly. This is an area that a lot of people have a lot of interest in. We had 35 respondents of people that were in corporate social responsibility jobs and 31 who were in supply chain management roles. We had really focused this particular survey on manufacturers, retailers, wholesalers, distributors, and we wanted to have companies that currently had corporate social responsibility goals. So what we wanted to know was, how are the goals being determined? How are they being used? How are we communicating about them? And we also wanted to find out what was important and how did people feel that they were doing against the attainment of goals in these areas. And we wanted to find out how corporate social responsibility brand promises were being tied to sustainability, and just find out where we were on alignment. Now, if you're in the audience and you want to be sure you have an audio recording of this for your greater group, this will be available on our website tomorrow, and we hope that you enjoy the results as much as we did. John, any thoughts about the survey before we go into it?
Well, I think it's a unique survey. We haven't really done a lot around this to see the alignment or misalignment of supply chain and sustainability goals. So I think you'll see through some of the findings that while there's been some good work done, there's still a lot of work left to do.
Absolutely. And so, one of the high-level findings for me, John, that I just found just totally intriguing is the fact that 92% of the respondents said that they had a corporate statement around sustainability goals, and 74% of companies responding said they actually tie it to their brand promise. but only 20% of the companies applied the sustainability goals to the entire value network, which, John, worries me because, based upon the interviews I've done, somewhere between 60 and 70% of renewable resources are outside of the corporate enterprise, the four walls. And does it worry you that many people are only looking at their four walls, not at that extended value chain?
Well, I think one of the things we have to keep in perspective is that corporations focusing on sustainability is a relatively recent phenomenon. I mean, we really saw a big uptick around 2004, 2005, when you had Walmart first introducing their sustainability program, GE's Eco-Imagination, IBM's Smarter Planet. So, we're still in the early days when it comes to implementing sustainability at a corporate level.
Right. Yeah, the average time that someone that answered this survey had been working on corporate sustainability was 6 years. And so does that sound about average to you for the industry?
That's about right. We do a report called the State of the Profession every year, and I think in our most recent version of that, that's about right for a leadership role career. I mean, I'll say this has evolved out of sort of corporate social responsibility and volunteerism and environmental health and safety, and these things are all evolving into this broader sustainability role.
But it's exciting, I think, John, because as we look at it, I think it's becoming a way that supply chain can be better understood by the organization. Now, one of the findings I found very interesting was that when we asked the two teams how well they knew the goals of the others, so in other words, how well did the corporate sustainability team know supply chain issues, and then we asked the supply chain team to give us how they felt about sustainability issues, we found that the sustainability team felt far more comfortable about supply chain than the supply chain team felt about sustainability. Did this surprise you?
No, in fact, this is what I expected, and there's a couple of reasons for this. I think one is that sustainability teams are relatively small. This isn't a group that is going to grow like the CIO's organization or even the supply chain organization. And so the people attracted to this have to be very nimble in looking all across the different functions in a company. But I think the other driver of this is that sustainability people are having to respond to resource issues, which we note later, things like palm oil and associated with deforestation, or conflict minerals in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where it was legislation in the Dodd-Frank bill that companies had to do a full track and trace from the origin. So I think these issues get focused on by sustainability and drive them over to the supply chain folks to get help and help integrate their strategies.
Well, and many supply chain folks have grown up through functional silos, John. If we think about manufacturing, and many manufacturing folks have only been in manufacturing, or procurement folks only have been in procurement. One of the issues that supply chain teams have is getting a greater understanding of the whole. And so it'll be interesting to see what the audience thinks. What we'd like to do now is have an audience poll of those that are on the phone. Why do you think there's this dichotomy? Why do you think that the corporate sustainability team feels that they know supply chain better than the supply chain team feels that they know corporate sustainability? Do you, number one, think it's the newness of the corporate sustainability program and the fact that, we've got a new team that's had to go figure it out? Or do we think that the supply chain team is busy, that they've been working on, many business issues and just haven't had time for alignment? Or is it an issue of leadership and just lack of alignment? If you can pick what you think is the most fitting answer for you, we'd appreciate it, and we'll get a feel for the audience. John, one thing that occurs to me is that sustainability team may know a little, but may not know a lot about supply chain. Do you think it's possible that the teams are new and they don't know what they don't know?
Oh, I think most definitely. But what we see with sustainability executives is that they have a lot of curiosity, but you're right, they need the education and the assistance of the supply chain team. So we are seeing in some companies where people are embedding instead of hiring a new person for the sustainability team, they'll take that resource and embed them in the supply chain organization so they get a better understanding of what's going on there and how they can have an impact.
Yeah, I see that as well. I don't see the other thing happening as much, though, where the supply chain team is putting somebody into the sustainability team. But you know, I think that idea of cross-functional movement is a great idea. So thank you, Connie, for pushing that to us. And, you know, the highest level response at 50%, John, is lack of alignment. 30% believe it's the newness of the program, and 20% believe that they're just busy. How does that feel to you, John?
Oh, I think that feels about right, especially given the topic we're going to hit in our next slide.
Yes, it's kind of a setup for our next slide, right?
We couldn't have planned it better.
Yeah, so, you know, John and I designed the study to really understand how well the two teams were aligned. It was our belief that since the two teams frequently report through a different organizational leader and the fact that sustainability programs are relatively new, that we would find some gaps in alignment. And I got to say, John, some of the gaps I found in alignment were greater than I thought. I don't know how you feel about that. Pretty consistent or greater than you thought?
Well, I think from my perspective, having talked with a lot of people in sustainability, it's pretty consistent with what I expected.
Okay, well, let's look at what we found. So one was the focus, and what we found was when push came to shove and a decision needed to be made, the companies will bend over and make supply chain decisions over corporate social responsibility goals. And so 56% of the respondents said supply chain goals come first, 32% equal priority, and 8% said CSR first. John, did you expect this?
You know, it's a little higher than I thought it might be, but I think what happens and what has to happen from a sustainability person's perspective is that rather than trying to impose a program onto supply chain, they really need to go over there, find out, really deeply understand what the supply chain goals are, and then provide their perspective on how they can help them meet that goal and meet their sustainability goals. And I think when they get to that conversation, you can really have a win-win and have, you know, sort of that equal priority. But they've got to get more goal alignment, and I think that's one of the biggest things that needs to occur.
Well, you know, John, one of the things that was interesting for me in doing the research for the report was there doesn't seem to be a natural embedding of the corporate social responsibility or sustainability processes into the supply chain processes, like network design or the sales and operations planning process or the supply planning process for manufacturing or the transportation routing process. And it seems to me that embedding CSR objectives into those would be a good place to start, you know, to be sure that they're not ad hoc. Thoughts? Anybody you see in doing that?
Well, yeah, I think, you know, just like they did with sort of logistics and supply chain to grow so large, Walmart is probably also the one leading in embedding this into their procurement processes, their transportation, you know, from straight up truck design and trailer design to their network design. They've really embedded it into their operations, and it's starting to show up now. You know, but it's been a process over the past several years. But they're one of the examples of a company that's really driving it from a supply chain point of view.
Absolutely. So first of all, it's focus. So we find a gap in alignment there. Second thing we found is performance. Even though the supply chain processes are 6 times older than sustainability, companies are more likely to rate themselves higher on corporate sustainability program execution than supply chain, which, John, we've only been at corporate sustainability for 6 years and supply chain for 30, and, what do you think about this?
Well, I think one of the things about this is that a lot of companies have either voluntarily or through shareholder pressure been asked to produce a citizenship or a sustainability report. And so a lot of communication over the past 6 to 8 years from companies about what they're doing, whereas, there's never been pressure in a company's annual report to call out the supply chain numbers or the, supply chain information. So I think supply chain executives suffer from a lack of communication to the rest of the organization.
I agree. Couldn't agree more. And then if we move on, John, this one kind of hurt a little bit. When we first designed the survey, I thought that these groups would put corporate social responsibility fairly high in the list of pains in the organization or things that really were focus points. And what we find is it rates pretty low, that, the day-to-day business demands of commodity prices and volatility and compliance and growth of new products and changing market preference, the list goes on. And then we've got corporate social responsibility. What do you think about this?
Well, I think one of the things that if we do this again, we would dig into a little bit more, I think is this top item on rising commodity prices, because I think a lot of sustainability folks are looking at this both in terms of climate change, in terms of conflict minerals, that managing the supply chain in terms of commodities and their access to them is part and parcel of the sustainability mission of the company.
Right, and in the study we do see that more teams have expanded the focus into the supplier base than into the channel base. So I agree that we would probably see more overlap there. Now, in terms of what people are measuring, we ask, first of all, do you have a goal? And second of all, how important is this goal to your overall performance? And then how would you rate yourself on that goal? And then we also ask, what's the easiest to track? So, John, energy rated high across everything. People have a goal. It's important. They rate themselves fairly high on performance, and they think it's easy to track. It seems like people are feeling better about energy than anything else. And then when we get to waste, folks typically will have a goal. It's important, but maybe not as important as energy. It rates fairly high, and I was actually surprised to see waste rate this high in terms of, people's actual perceived performance. A little bit more difficult to track. And then when we get to carbon, people, by and large, will have a goal. The green looks at the top 3 elements that people picked. It rates very high in importance, but now we start to fall off on how people are actually performing. And in the interviews, people are struggling to be able to get to data, and it's not as easy to track. Water, on the other hand, is easier to track, and people are doing a little less in terms of actual performance. Recycled content, 42% have a goal. It's very important. People rate themselves pretty high on performance, but it isn't so easy to track. And then we get to conflict minerals, which you were talking about, the recent legislation. 41% have a goal. Most of this is happening in the discrete industry. It's important, 37%. Some of that is because not everyone in the demographics is from the industry that, this really hits. But only 11% in terms of tracking. What do you think about this, John?
Well, I think first to the energy usage and waste reduction, sustainability teams don't get big budgets. They need to go around to other parts of the organization. And so these are two areas where you can show a bottom line cost savings by having a different focus on operations. So it didn't surprise me at all that these are the two highest ones ranked. And the carbon footprint thing, while it may look like the difficulty to track, I think what you're seeing there is not necessarily the company's four walls carbon footprint that's difficult, but companies are being asked by the Carbon Disclosure Project to track their entire supply chain's carbon footprint. And so going back up the supply chain for these tier 3 footprint measurements is much more difficult than just, what your company footprint is.
Yeah, really good point. What about water? In terms of water usage, the performance on the water, did that surprise you?
No, I think it depends on industry, right? If you're dependent upon agriculture, or if you're a bottler or a brewer, water is the #1 thing you're focused on. If you're a distributor, your impact on water is much less.
Okay, so it's just the industries in terms of how it falls out. Now, when we looked at what people tie to their marketing claims, top is recycled content, then reduced energy, and recyclable products. How about this? Did this surprise you at all?
No, I think this is, again, partly a response to regulation. I mean, the FTC has green guidelines as to what you can claim in your green promises. And so you can measure recycled content and recyclability of a product, whereas, while there's an organic label or natural, you sort of get into that gray zone of greenwashing. So, I think this is pretty consistent.
I was just surprised to see that 74% had a claim. Did that surprise you, John?
That seems a little
high
to me. Yeah.
Yeah. I found that to be interesting. I actually thought it would be more like 50, but anyway, these are people that are very aligned with this, imperative. Now, John, one of the things that I followed really closely and I thought was interesting, as people are going out into the supply base and trying to make sure that the supply base is aligned, one of the things they're trying to figure out is what works the best. And I thought it was interesting that the supply chain team and the corporate social responsibility teams had the gap on third-party audits. Third-party audits don't work very well. And, I think we're seeing this in the data.
Yeah, and I think that's why you especially see that the CSR folks responding had very little confidence in third-party audits, and yet, they agreed with the supply chain folks that, codes of conduct are an important way. And I think we're also seeing, like in the electronics industry, there's a group, the EICC, that actually is looking for a harmonized code of conduct so that instead of having every company go to the same factory to ask them about their practices, having a single company go take responsibility for it, but then use the money you're saving to invest in training and raising the level of environmental and social aspects for that factory.
But John, over the last 10 years, we've seen so many audits go awry, whether it's, the peanut butter audits, which, should have caught the issues around the plants with salmonella, or the fires that were in India and Bangladesh. I mean, audits just don't work very well, and supplier accountability and supplier team development issues and really getting at that from a relationship standpoint just seem to be working much, much better. I mean, I think it really depends upon, redefining that relationship in the supplier base.
Couldn't agree more.
Now, when we look at who does it best, I found this interesting, John, because, we've talked about, where we saw alignment gaps. But here where we said, who does it best? And I thought it was very interesting that, Unilever comes very high. You know, Unilever has always really pushed sustainability, one of the early leaders, and of course Patagonia is well known, and Walmart was a leader in the defining of, you know, the Walmart scorecards, and IBM led in the redefinition of remanufacturing, and Intel and Starbucks. You know, these are people I would have expected. What I found very interesting was the overlap, you know, as you know, Walmart is on both lists. Procter & Gamble's further down on sustainability than they are on supply chain, and Apple's not on the sustainability list. And Dell, you know, is on both lists, but at different places, and so does IBM. So there's some overlap, but it looks like the emphasis of the companies really come out here.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, yeah, I think you know, Unilever at the top for CSR, and their CEO Paul Pullman is very vocal about that's going to be their term for their method of growth, and that if you're looking for short-term investment, don't invest in us. We're doing this long-term, and it's going to drive everything that we do at the company. So, you know, between Unilever and Yvon Chouinard at Patagonia, I think that what shows here is on the CSR side that a strong CEO pushing this raises this higher up.
Right, and those are very strong CEOs. And, you know, you can see here that, you know, it's mattering in terms of peer feedback. Where we have the red circles, we have significance, you know, in terms of the responses. So, you know, I found this to be very interesting. You know, it's more than, you know, just talk. So now let's hear from our panelists. John, any couple of tidbits for the audience before we close here and turn it over to the panelists about your insights from the study?
No, I want to get to the panelists because I think some of the things that DuPont did a long time ago, and I think they show like what they did in partnering with Ford to sort of rethink how you paint a car and how that works is really a fascinating story that I don't know if Peter will have time for. And then I think in the dairy industry, we're seeing a lot of focus on, you know, from everyone from Walmart back trying to figure out how to use sustainability to improve agricultural practices as well as manufacturing practices. So let's dive into it.
Okay, these are two great case studies. So Peter, with that, I'm going to turn it on to you.
Well, thank you, Laura. And my picture here is when I was in Milan in November talking about sustainable supply chain. So as you know, it's really a global focus now, much more so outside the United States in some aspects, but not all, than it is within the U.S. Some of the things that sort of we've experienced that echo some of the things you're seeing in your report is that, you know, CSR reporting is no longer differentiating. We were a pioneer along with Dow Chemical in CSR reporting, and that's because, you know, most major materials companies or science-based companies have always faced a lot of regulation, and you know, we wanted to step out, and we're looking forward to, you know, new strategies to you know, reduce our impact on the environment way back about 20 years ago. So, you know, we've always been very steadfast in our reporting, and it's always accurate, but now everybody reports. And so there is not much measurable information out there that it's easy to put your hands on and say, how do I compare one company to another? Large companies like DuPont and others are getting involved in the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, which is now partnered with the European SAM Index. And we participated in one of the more extensive surveys this year for that. And so that's beginning to provide more quantitative information on big companies. But the big challenge with CSR reporting is that it really needs to move to something that's got greater transparency and, more importantly, the ability to benchmark for it to create value. I think the big thing that drives innovation in this space is that resource intensity of the value networks is really the future, because if you look at, you know, energy, which everyone can kind of get their head around, which is related to carbon, and when you pump water you need energy, so it's all very tied together. It's a resource, and if you can figure out how to make one supply chain less resource intensive, whether it's within your own control, product by product, or you're comparing it to someone else's similar product, and you want to be less resource intense, I mean, that's the name of the game. And there's a lot of similarity to making it less capital intensive or less labor intensive. There's a lot of things when you think about supply chain that we've been able to apply that help sort of bridge that gap over to sustainability and make it more practical from beyond a reporting standpoint. And that leads to my third point here, which is practical steps exist right now that can be successfully employed and deployed to do this. They're just not widespread. We really embraced it, and I did it in the design of a new business in the last couple of years around cellulosic fuels, which are non-food-based fuels, to produce ethanol fuels, and so it can actually be done. It's just that these techniques and methods are not well known and not widespread, and because there isn't a good measurable process, it's really hard for anybody, whether you're in a B2B situation or a consumer to business situation, to really know what's accurate and what's true beyond the marketing. If you go to the next one, I'll kind of give you my big epiphany on this was, I never really had a hard time understanding this, maybe because it was my background in when I was growing up in Vermont, everyone heated with wood, you hauled wood. My father had solar hot water in the 1970s because it was practical and cheaper, not because it was some great thing to do. My mother had a huge garden. It's just what people did. So it was never hard for me to understand this. But it was a real challenge when you get into big B2B business stuff, but it really comes down to mindset, so how you think about it. And in the next couple of slides, I want to illustrate some of this, but for us in DuPont, and I think this applies to a lot of companies, is if you can get your head around the risk side, which is often governed by compliance requirements and regulation, and go from focusing only on that to say, how can I use that as a springboard towards innovation and towards improvement, that's really a shift in your thinking. The other one that you mentioned in your research is that supply chain maturity, and if you really think about, supply chain maturity is driven by taking an outside-in or demand-driven view to really get to higher levels of maturity and performance. If you take that same kind of thinking, you can apply it to the sustainable aspects of supply chain as well, that it takes that outside-in type of thinking. And then, the thing I want to end with, I'll just give a brief illustration, and John touched on this. The automotive industry is a huge customer. That value chain is a huge customer for DuPont and other companies. And one of the reasons I've pushed sustainable supply chains within DuPont is so that we can better address the needs of that industry, which has embraced sustainable performance in a lot of different ways for various reasons, both from a marketing standpoint, a compliance standpoint, and just realizing that if they want to thrive as an industry, they've got to deal with it. So I'll touch on that as well. So if you go to the next slide. I think to kind of simplify the thoughts here, I kind of broke it down into three main points. When you think about going from risk to innovation at the top, the why, as I said, is to drive down resource intensity. That's the goal. And that's a very understandable thing from a supply chain management standpoint. If you inserted, I want to drive down working capital intensity up there, and most supply chain folks would immediately understand that. And it's really a matter of how you are going to drive that activity to meet your market needs on the right, and then how you're going to address that with your supplier markets on the left, and how you're going to really carry that through your supply chain work. So that's really the why is, why would we do this? It's because you want to drive down resource intensity. And then in the middle, how do you get to sustainable growth? Well, you've got to collaborate, and you've got to begin to think about how do you innovate away from that risk. So on that sort of pink bar in the middle on the left, everyone's got to manage risk in some ways. You've got to manage operational risk. You've got to deal with compliance and regulation, and everybody knows you have to do those things. But, and for us, our culture is very steeped in safety and has been from the beginnings, a couple hundred years ago. So that's really inherent to the way we think and do things. But for us, that was a real springboard to say, well, safety then leads to better operational performance, and you can easily say, well, if I want better operational performance, reducing energy usage is something that I can factor into that. I can use common tools like Six Sigma and Lean to help me do that. You can make better choices in terms of capital investments to do that as well. And then you start to say, well, what can I do to add to the value proposition? Do I, like we do, we make a lot of products, about $8 billion of our revenue is tied to sustainable supply bases. So whether it's renewable materials or non-resource intensive or less resource intensive raw materials. And then you can say, well, if I can do that, if I can make my products renewable, less resource intensive, then I possibly can shift that into the way that I operate my business, and that for us leads to business model innovation, where we've done things like cellulosic fuels that other people have never been able to do, and things in agriculture and food. So we really took it as a way to drive innovation out of that risk. So that's sort of what we've tried to do. And then the how is the part that we're still struggling with, and I think everybody is how do you do this in a scalable way? How do you do this across many different parts of the business life cycle? How do you do this into various industries that have different levels of appreciation for it, and also back into the supply base? And that when I've done it, using the SCORE model, which we use as the backbone of all our supply chain work, and then combining it with knowledge from sustainability groups and from our sustainability teams and from APICS around supply chain, you begin to address some of those things. But it's not yet a consistent body of knowledge, so it's hard to really, you have to do it a small team at a time. It's hard to really move that to a bigger scale because there isn't consistent knowledge about that. Are there did you have any thoughts or questions on that? Because I know those are sort of 3 key points, because I'm going to get into some other stuff here in a minute.
No, I don't think we do have any questions on that. Why don't we go ahead and talk about your journey?
Well, here's the journey for us, and I think this applies to a lot of people. So this is sort of the traditional supply chain journey, at least in the first 2 blocks. So, a lot of journeys start with trying to get visibility and just get control over your supply chain, because that's pretty hard as it is. And then the next big step is to try to drive at predictability. And I think, for most of our businesses, we're really, driving at that predictability piece. And it's really saying, how do you begin to plan ahead? How do you begin to get your hands around demand and demand variability and volatility? And then how do you translate that back, through your supply chain to manage it? And that's really kind of that leverage point. And then we began to realize a couple of years ago that the next big step is resilience, which for us means, proactively managing risk, doing scenario planning, becoming more flexible and agile, developing more standard ways of doing things globally so that we could more easily manage things when there's dynamics and change, which are always things that will happen. And then there was a realization that to truly become sustainable from a performance standpoint alone, you had to get beyond, just managing risk, but be able to be successful in managing risk, which is what we consider resilience. And then you can really start to work on that resource intensity, which involves everything from materials to capital to people. You're able to shift better into a continuous improvement mode, sort of the YF of X of the world from Six Sigma of investment, improvement, end-to-end performance. And then, we are certainly not there yet, but we're working on it, is to get to, I call it high definition data. So, you got to get quality data somewhere in there back in the predictability block, but high definition data is getting the right resolution of all the data that's out there and doing it in a timely way. And that combination, is going to get at both the bottom line and the top line. So that's really kind of looking at it from a traditional supply chain standpoint, and there's lots of room to improve, and the more efficient and effective your supply chain is, generally it's going to be more sustainable as well. If you go to the next slide, you start to think about that same set of steps from a true sustainability standpoint. This is, I think, where people often get confused. I know when I talk about this publicly, this is where people sometimes get a little stuck, and it may be part of what was indicated in your survey, that people think they do well on sustainability because it's not well defined. And if you're struggling with visibility, my sort of feeling about it is the best thing you can do is replace something. You can replace light bulbs. I was talking to a friend of mine who is the supply chain director for the New York City Housing Authority, and Gary was saying at one time, it's easy for me to go out and replace light bulbs, but unless I change the behaviors or I know when the light bulbs are broken, it's not going to make that big difference in the energy usage in the housing units. The next thing as you get to predictability is you can begin to recycle and focus more on efficiency because you're planning better. And so I say that's really the key part, just like it is in all other supply chain areas, is that level of predictability really gets you off to the right point to really truly drive sustainability. And then resilience, it's really about, can you renew after something doesn't go right? And then to truly get to sustainability and sustainable growth, you really got to get your hands around resilience. And that's why I think people don't really have a full understanding of what sustainability really means. So often if you're selling sustainable products or ones that are labeled that way, you feel pretty good because there isn't any other standard, there's not much transparency, and there's very little you can benchmark against. So I think the challenge is both continuing to move up that supply chain capability, but at the same time recognize what truly you can do from a sustainability standpoint as you move up that same maturity curve. And I think is getting those two things aligned is going to be a next big step for a lot of companies, and it's where we've really been kind of working hard in DuPont to really get our heads around it and try to move sustainability from being a a group on the outside to one that's embedded in the supply chain operations teams. Go to the next one. Now, as an example, and I often use this to illustrate to people sort of what do you get out of this? So beyond just a nice thing to do or a good thing to do or a thing that you have to do, what's really the value chain benefit out of focusing on sustainability across supply chains? Now, for us and for a lot of companies, in sort of industries like DuPont, it's the automotive industry is a big market, and Volkswagen, being a European company, has been long focused on sustainability. And in about 2007 or 8, they were trying to sell in the United States a lifetime carbon neutral Golf, which is their standard automobile. And the way they were doing that was if you bought a Golf during that period of time, they would buy enough trees in the Mississippi Delta to offset the carbon emissions of the estimated lifetime of that car. So it was like the Lorax, it was all about the trees. Now that's really wonderful and that's great, but it really doesn't reduce the resource intensity of the vehicle itself. And we sell a lot of materials, from paint to polymers to electronic materials and safety glass and Kevlar belting, all of which can help the sustainability performance to some degree of an automobile. But it's very hard as you go through all those different value chain steps and all the participants to make that case in some coherent way. So it's pretty indirect and difficult if you try to kind of get there the traditional route. If you go to the next slide. If you think about it and combining all those things in a value chain perspective that's integrated and connects all those things back to that ultimate customer who is the automotive manufacturer, and in turn they're trying to sell an attribute, which is sustainability, to their customer, who's the consumer, as you begin to pull together all those pieces around how each of those components perform and help the end value in terms of sustainability of the car, you can have a much different discussion with the automotive manufacturer, and you can pull through those products through that fairly complex set of participants in the value chain. So that's where I see the future going, is the more you can master this, no matter who you are as a company, the better you can actually deliver that less, reduced resource intensity, the better transparency you have to make sure that you have a responsible supply chain, which is the elements of a sustainable supply chain that cover people, supply base, how labor is used. And so, it's the ability to look at it this way and communicate this way, I think, is where the future is headed. Any questions on what I had to say? I know it was a lot in a few minutes, but I want to stay with your timeline.
Well, let's just talk about it here in terms of balancing that impact, and what kind of insights do you have for the audience?
I think for the audience, I talk about sustainable supply chains a lot, both for APIX and for DuPont as well. And the thing that always comes back is people say, well, that's great. DuPont's big and it's been doing this for a long time and you have all these resources. And the answer is no, we don't have that many resources. As John pointed out, sustainability groups are pretty small. I was the only one for a long time doing the sustainable supply chain piece. And the answer is these are very, realistic things. And you can start, very small, no matter what size business you are. You can always come out with a statement and goals that you're trying to achieve. And you can do something as simple as there's always the ability to reduce paper usage. There's always the ability to reduce energy usage in very simple ways. And it's really beginning to kind of get the dialogue going in your firm, no matter what size you are, to say, what does this really mean to us, our strategy, our value proposition, and what do our customers expect? And begin to get your heads around it. So as David's slide is pointing out here, it's not just about feeling good about it, and it's really about how do you practically move it forward. And I think for the audience, that's the thing you need to think about is what can you practically do? How do you get your head around it? How do you begin to understand the value for your company, for you and your position in the company? And once you begin to think about that, there's a lot of ways that you can go forward, no matter whatever the size of the organization is or wherever you sit in a value chain.
Thank you so much, Peter. David, let's shift to you. Wells, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you're doing and how you got started on this triple bottom line?
Sure. Thank you, Laura. And I'm going to touch on much of what's been said, and hopefully I can provide a few nuggets that'll fill in some of the cracks. How did we get started? It came about probably from several different sources, whether it's through a customer or it's where we're operating within our community. maybe some forces from our supply base, but we realized that there were a lot of opportunities. So as we wanted to embark on that path, we first needed to decide how are we going to go about this. So that's why I shared with you, what does sustainability mean to our organization? So we went out and we sought different definitions and different approaches that were going on across many different industries. And when we looked at this, we had some parts of our organization who wanted to weave this into the marketing message, which we felt that's going to have more of a social impact and how that can be woven into how we promote our products. But we realized that there had to be different dimensions to it, and one of the primary dimensions was we're not going to do this just because it makes us feel good. As Peter described, there has to be an impact. And we also recognized that we wanted to tie incentives back into the goals. And there's an old saying in that people respond to incentives. Everything else is just commentary. And we realized that, but we also knew that we were going to have to address the environmental aspect of it, given our industry as well, because there's a lot of regulation that continues to evolve over time, as well as special interest groups that get involved in our business. So we wanted to take this three-prong approach. So if we go to the next slide and kind of understand why is it important to Wells Dairy. So we tried to create that current state as you were mentioning, Laura, and understand what's it going to mean to us. So how can we compete in the marketplace around this? Walmart's been mentioned many times. We are a major supplier to Walmart. We know many of us are aware of Walmart's scorecard and the initiatives that they have within their organization. So that was one of the forces that was helping to drive where we were crafting our sustainability program. And then we looked at what are those economic aspects that we can have incentives that are going to be woven into what our sustainability program makes for us. And I'll share with you one of the unique things that we felt that is driving a lot of incentives with this is how we take this back into our supply base. And as you know, we procure a lot of milk and cream, which gets produced by animals, and the whole impact that that has around waste streams and feedstuffs and environmental impacts. So we sat down with many of those within our supply base to have an alliance around how we're going to approach sustainability. So we wove incentives into our supply contracts with particular goals, time horizons, and how we could mutually benefit. And we realized it couldn't be a zero-sum game. How do we make this a win-win? So I share with you that it was very important for us to contractually identify what those sustainability goals were going to be. And that has helped to drive a lot of the performance that we've realized. And then we also generate a lot of resources that we realized that we couldn't continue to send stuff to a landfill. We also have a municipal wastewater treatment facility that was continuing to experience additional regulations, and they were starting to cap out on their capability. So we looked internally as to how we could better manage our waste stream through less use of water, more effective use of our materials. And then as we gained traction through all of these efforts, we realized that there was a lot of economic opportunities that could be had within the organization. So it was really more of a snowballing effect once we got started. So then it leads me to the next slide, how we got started. And we recognized that we had to have alliance internally across the various functions, and I would say the more important functions were with finance and our senior leadership, because we within supply chain had a lot of understanding of the benefits of this, but we realized without those financial partners and senior leadership to help drive a lot of the initiatives and the efforts across the organization, we felt that we were only going to be able to take it so far. We also engaged many of the other internal functions around our environmental functions and had incentives that were aligned around the various goals that they were trying to achieve. And then we also realized, especially through the efforts that we were having to support around Walmart, and how we were going to audit, how we were going to measure the progress that we were making. So if we go to next steps, the next slide, then you get into a prioritization exercise, because you can't just take a shotgun approach to this. So we balance resources with priorities, and then understanding what the returns were going to be, not only internally but externally, as we also align with our customers. So I would share with you, there was connection into our supply base, and we took that all the way into connection with our customers and helping our customers meet specific goals that they were trying to drive back into the value chain, but also the economic benefits that they could realize from this as well. So then I would go to the, what does this mean going forward? Well, through our efforts, and I would also share with you, it's the old adage around what gets measured gets done and gets improved. And we felt that having that scorecard, not only internally, but how our scorecard was aligned with our suppliers and our customers. And we realized a lot of benefits and a lot of gain in the efforts that we were putting forward here. And in our Western society, we like to keep score, and as we kept score, it became competitive. And as the momentum caught hold within our organization as well as our stakeholders, the scorecard aspect became woven into our overall tracking that we had throughout our entire organization across our entire stakeholder base. And we're just, if you wanted to unravel this, you couldn't at this point. So going to the next slide around sustainability, and this brings me back to where we started. And I think what was most important for us is that we had to have this balance, that it couldn't be just good for the environment, or it couldn't just be something that's going to drive economic benefits. So if it isn't good for the environment, and if it doesn't save us money, we felt that then it's not going to be green, and why would we do it? So I would open it up to any comments or questions, or need any additional clarification.
Well, I think we've had some great case studies here, and unfortunately we're running a little bit short on time. We do have a few questions that the audience had given us, though, John. If you think about companies, and many will pursue because of cost, and David, I love your quote that if you wanted to unravel this now, you couldn't. But John Davies, if you think about companies, question from the audience, can you think of anyone that's just done it for corporate social responsibility, or are the progressions a lot like what David said? They get started and maybe cost, and then they just kind of snowball from there.
There aren't that many companies who do it just to do good. I mean, that's called philanthropy, and that's a different part of their organization. I think both Peter and David made the important point that it's got to make business sense. But what's important for people to understand, and what I think they both demonstrated, is that when you put that sustainability lens on the supply chain, you start finding opportunities that you weren't thinking about to eliminate waste, to be more efficient. And I think that's the real takeaway here today.
Yeah, I think so too. And Peter, a question for you. Audience asked, will the APIC CSCP focus more on sustainability and future updates? Any insight on that work?
Yeah, I mean, already the CPIM in its latest edition, we've gone module by module, has got more clarity around sustainability. And then CSCP, which is an evergreen product, will incorporate more than it has already. And then The other big effort we're making is trying to update what was called Green Score, which is really on the Supply Chain Council side, to make that much more visible. And so those two efforts between those two big supply chain groups, I think, will really lead down the path to more accessible information about how to do these things practically.
Okay. And then there's a couple of questions around study demographics, and this study is available on our website, and the demographics are laid out. Most of the companies are global and such. You can't pick out North America versus European, but you can see the demographics on the study. Anyway, I want to thank my panelists. I thought they were great case studies, great insights. Thank you for joining us and supporting Supply Chain Insights. And I encourage folks to listen to our next webinar. We are committed to monthly webinars. It is our goal that the research becomes the backdrop for supply chain leaders to talk about what's happening. Our next webinar is featuring two fantastic speakers, just like the fantastic speakers we had today. Fran O'Sullivan, who leads the IBM manufacturing practice, and Michael Corbo, who leads the Colgate supply chain team, are going to talk about their race for Supply Chain 2020. So I want to wrap up. Thank you to everyone that joined today, and thank you very much. Have a great rest of the afternoon. All the best.
Ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude today's webinar. You may now disconnect your lines. Thank you, and have a nice day.